want to start out talking about how the lead up to the Second World War in terms of Japan and Japan's role. Japan in the late 1860s under the Meiji Restoration, and again I've given you bits and pieces of this as we went along because the history sort of interweaves and overlaps. But in 1868, after the Meiji Restoration, the emperor was put back in charge in Japan and determined to really upgrade the technical ability, the manufacturing, the military of Japan. His goal was to make Japan into a power that would be equivalent to those powers in the West, like Britain and France, the Netherlands, others, and the United States that had had so much authority and so much control over the things happening in the East. So they proceeded to create a very effective military, to produce manufacturing as a primary, and really catch up with the rest of the world. But as we've talked about several times, that involved them needing oil and coal and iron to make steel, none of which are naturally occurring on the Japanese islands. And so they looked around for where they could find those things, and the place that was closest to them, obviously, is Korea. And so they continued to try to be involved in Korea, because Korea had been primarily under the sort of control or auspices of China for a very long time. It led in 1894 to the first Sino-Japanese War. That is, China and Japan went to war, and everyone thought that Japan didn't stand a chance because China had always been seen as the power in East Asia. They had a huge army, but unfortunately for them, they had not been nearly as effective in improving and upgrading and modernizing their military as had Japan. So in a matter of just 6 months, Japan defeated China in the first Sino-Japanese War. Well, because of that, they sort of took over control of Korea for the most part, and were given Hong Kong, I'm sorry, not Hong Kong, they were given some of the other ports to control. They were given the Leyte Peninsula in Manchuria, but the Russians had their own ideas about this. So the Russians got a couple of other Western powers to say to Japan, no, you shouldn't be in Manchuria, and so Japan backed off. They didn't feel like they were in a position to fight three major Western powers, Russia, France, and Germany. And so at that point, the Japanese were struggling, and they kept trying to negotiate with Russia to say, look, you can have Manchuria, because Russia had already, after they convinced the Japanese not to take the Liaodong Peninsula, the Russians leased it for 25 years from the Chinese and built a port at Port Arthur. And that port gave them a warm water port on the Pacific, because the only other port they had in Russia was Vladivostok, which is further north, and it freezes up in the winter, so they couldn't get their ships in and out. So Russia has really taken advantage of the situation, and Japan keeps trying to negotiate, and they were prepared to say, I think you're wanted over there, right over there.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Great job.
So she was so frantic, I didn't want to leave her just waving over there. So Japan could not even get Russia to negotiate with them. They were prepared to say, you can have Manchuria, China, if you give us control of Korea so that we can get the resources we need. Russia kept putting off and putting off and putting off, and finally Japan decided that they had to do something. So in 1904, they launched a surprise attack against Port Arthur. And the short version of this story, which I've told a couple of times now in lectures, is that 1904-1905, the Russo or Russian-Japanese War, the Japanese defeated the Russians. Nobody thought that was possible. They not only defeated them, they completely destroyed two of Russia's three navies. They had three main fleets, and they destroyed two of them. So at this point, Japan takes over Korea, turns Korea into a colony that is providing slave labor and food and other materials for Japan. And over a period of time, Japan actually tries to destroy the Korean economy, forcing them to take Japanese names, forcing them to not speak the Korean language, but speak Japanese instead. And they were not allowed to teach Korean history. They had to teach Japanese history, all sorts of things like that. Well, the rest of the world, especially the Western powers, were not thrilled about Japan not only taking over Korea and turning it into a colony, But then more and more, because the Russians had been driven out of Manchuria, they were getting more and more involved in Manchuria. They created the largest corporation in Asia, the South Manchurian Railway Corporation, which was not only railway, they got involved in ports and manufacturing and all sorts of things. And they were very, very wealthy. And in order to support that, more and more Japanese were moving into China. Finally getting tired of having China own the land that they were really taking advantage of. In 1931, the Japanese created an incident. It was falsified. It was a pretext in order to be able to send troops into Manchuria. They took over Manchuria entirely. They created a puppet empire called the Manchukuo, and the rest of the Western world is really upset now. The League of Nations sends in a group, and they do a report that says that this was all just a conniving plan by the Japanese, that there was no reason for them to send in troops. The Japanese reject that report, and they leave the League of Nations in 1933, so they don't have any even suggested controls over them. During all this time, more and more, the Western powers are trying to embargo oil shipments and iron shipments into Japan. I mean, they have access themselves to Korea, but from anywhere outside, they're doing everything they can. The United States freezes all Japanese assets at one point in this process. And so Japan, instead of being motivated to back off, they dug their heels in. And they got to the point of feeling like we're eventually going to have to fight a war in order to be able to control Korea and Manchuria and the other places that they've conquered. In 1937, they create another incident. Well, they didn't completely create this one, but they took a minor incident and used it as an excuse in 1937 to declare war against China. This is the second Sino-Japanese war. And they began a campaign of taking all of the ports. They controlled all of the ports of China. They took over Shanghai, they took over Nanking, which had been the capital of China at that point, and that's the period of time when we have what was called the Rape of Nanking, where 300,000 civilians were killed, 80,000 women were raped, and then most of them killed afterwards, and it was a horrendous time for the people of China. In 1938, the Japanese, because they control all the ports already, they are pressuring France and Britain and others to stop bringing in goods to China from other places because they want to choke off the Chinese since they're at war with them. And so more and more Japan and Western powers, including the United States, are coming into confrontation with one another over the Japanese presence. Less in Korea, that was less of a concern than in China. In 1941, after all of this buildup, and the United States and Japan were supposed to be negotiating, but on December 7th of 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise attack using an aircraft carrier fleet, support ships as well. There were cruisers and destroyers and others, but they attacked the main base of the Pacific Fleet of the U.S. Navy, because the Japanese thought the U.S. Navy was the only power that could possibly stop them from doing whatever they wanted to do in the Pacific. Their goal was to create, and they had a slogan for it even, East Asia for East Asians. What it meant was East Asia for Japan, because their intention was to create a sphere of economic connection through the whole of Southeast Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific Islands, that they would control, and they would have access to whatever resources they wanted. Well, in order to stop the U.S. Navy, they attacked Pearl Harbor just before 8 o'clock on December 7th, 1941, and they succeeded in destroying much of the American fleet. My light's getting dimmer. They sank 8 battleships in Pearl Harbor, or damaged 8 battleships. 4 of them sunk. They later were able to bring 3 of them back, and 6 of those battleships in total were able to rejoin the war later on. So they weren't as effective. And there was a critical mistake made here. They did not destroy the fuel bunkers. They did not destroy the repair facilities on Pearl Harbor, and that meant that the Americans were able not only to continue to fuel and supply the ships once they were repaired, but they also had the ability to continue to repair them. And America proved that they had an extraordinary ability to not only repair, but to produce new machinery, weapons of war, ships, etc. Yamamoto was the military leader who was in charge of planning this attack, and he was quoted as saying, prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, "I shall run wild considerably for the first 6 months or a year, but I have absolutely no confidence for the second or third years." Japan attacked with, well, at the start of the war, they had a total of 236 ships, and all of the Allies only had 221. So Japan started the war at an advantage in terms of materiel. The Americans had one good thing happen with regard to this, and that is the aircraft carriers were not in port when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The U.S. had not invested greatly in aircraft carriers, but the ones they had were out on maneuvers, and so they were not destroyed. All the way up until 1940, so we're talking just the year before this, the assumption had been made in naval battle planning that the most important ship, the most powerful ship, were battleships. It had only been in the previous year that various nations, and Japan was right on the forefront of this, figured out that the air power that you could bring to bear from an aircraft carrier was even greater than the ability to launch 16-inch, 2,000-pound shells for 30 miles or whatever it was. So they attacked the battleships, but the aircraft carriers got away from them. And a thing that a lot of people don't realize is at the same time, the same day, within 7 hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese also attacked the U.S. possessions in the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island. They attacked the British possessions of Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong, all within 7 hours of Pearl Harbor's attack. So it was a coordinated effort to try to knock the Allies out, because these were the most important bases that the U.S. and Britain had. So this map represents the fact that this is Manchuria that they control. Because they had declared war, they had moved down here and were expanding their areas of control. But you'll notice that every one of the ports along here was controlled by the Japanese. Because of their attacks on the December 7th and immediately following that, they ended up controlling Burma, Thailand, French Indochina, British Malaya, various of the other East Indian islands, and then later on the Philippines. As they proceeded, the Japanese had very specific plans for moving. They wanted to create a line of defense, that's what these symbols represent, and to continue to push it further and further out. Within just a few months of Pearl Harbor, actually in April of 1942, Jimmy Doolittle's raid, famous raid, they flew B-29 bombers, 16 of them, off of the USS Hornet, bombed Tokyo. Now it was only 16 planes and it didn't do any significant damage. It was more just a gesture than anything else. And then they landed in China. But we were too far away to do much more than that. The B-29 was the largest plane that could take off from an aircraft carrier, and it couldn't land on an aircraft carrier, so they had to land in China. Later on, the goal was to try to get closer and closer to Japan so that there could be air bases from which could fly larger, more devastating planes. This was the goal that the Japanese had, this orange line. This was Yamamoto's plan. He wanted to control this is where they were in April of 1942, so just 5 months after Pearl Harbor. They had succeeded in taking all of this. They wanted to control all of the Coral Sea down here, New Caledonia, the South Solomon Islands. They also wanted to be able to take over Midway. That would have put them close enough to attack Hawaii and even to attack the coastline of the United States. And they felt if they could take Midway and be in striking range, two things would happen. One, they would keep the Allies from being within striking range, but secondly, they would be able themselves to launch attacks that they hoped would cause America, the United States especially, but other allies as well, to sue for peace, to back out of the war, and to give them what they wanted, which was this whole area as an area of economic control. Well, the first battle, and the Japanese were winning everything. Nobody seemed to be able to stop them. They were taking island after island. They were winning victory after victory. The first time, and I'm going to use just like 5 or 6 battles, and that I think there are reasons why these were critical battles in the Pacific War. The first one, which I talked about the last time I did the talk, is the Battle of the Coral Sea. Just so you know, this is the Coral Sea, whoops, down here. It's alongside Australia, between New Guinea, Australia, the Solomon Islands, and New Caledonia, right here. Well, the desire of the Japanese was to take over Port Moresby in New Guinea, which is right in here, and in doing so, and take over these islands so that they would be able to cut Australia off from almost any contact, because they control the area to the north and anything that's land-based here to the west, if they can control the east. And of course, down here you don't have anything except Antarctica. So their goal was to cut Australia off from any of the other allies. So they tried to do that by sending in a fleet in May of 1942, 4th to the 8th of May. And the red represents the Japanese fleets that came down. And again, their goal was Port Moresby, but they wanted to be able to control all this area. Just prior to this, the American code breakers, intelligence code breakers, had succeeded in breaking the Japanese code. This was absolutely critical, because not only for this battle, but for future battles. And the Japanese never figured out that they had broken their codes. So the Japanese sent in carrier groups and support ships here. The Americans came in with aircraft carrier groups. Now this is the first time the Japanese didn't win an outright victory. They actually destroyed more American ships than the Allies destroyed of the Japanese ships, but they did not accomplish what they were trying to, and that is to take over Port Moresby in New Guinea and to establish control of this region. And in the process, they lost a lot of their pilots. They lost one of their smaller aircraft carriers, but it's because we knew they were coming. This is the first battle ever in history that the ships, a naval battle, where the ships never saw each other. And secondly, the reason they didn't see each other is it's the first naval battle ever fought entirely by aircraft. So it was entirely airplanes flying off of Japanese and American, Australian aircraft carriers that were responsible for fighting this battle. The Japanese lost enough and that they finally decided they needed to back off, maybe come back later. And so the Coral Sea both preserved Australia as being able to remain in contact and connection with the rest of the Allies, and it also is the first time the Japanese were pushed back at all. So very important. But in addition to being down here, New Caledonia, which they did not succeed in taking over the Coral Sea, they also, Yamamoto's plan is this dotted line, they also wanted to take over Midway Island, which was the next closest island to Hawaii and another U.S. protectorate. Again, the Americans read their codes, broke their codes and read their messages. They knew they were coming. The goal of the Japanese at Midway Island was to break the back of the rest of the U.S. Navy, particularly the aircraft carriers, and in doing so, again, and if they could take Midway Island, convince the Americans to sue for peace, to stop it right there. So on June 4th through the 7th, we have the Battle of Midway Island. This is 1942, so we're talking about only 6 months after Pearl Harbor and 1 month after the Japanese had not succeeded at Coral Sea. You can't really say they were defeated, because they sank more of our ships than we did of theirs, but they did manage to back the Japanese out of there so that they couldn't control it. So the Battle of Midway, the goal was for the Japanese Navy, they sent multiple aircraft carrier and their support groups, the fleet ships, in the effort to try to ambush the American fleet. But they couldn't ambush them because the Americans had translated their codes. So what happened was, when they attacked Midway Island, they were surprised to find out that there were carrier groups, particularly the Hornet carrier group and others. Before the day was done, the Japanese had lost 4 of their large aircraft carriers. Now, they only had 6 aircraft carriers that participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, so you get an idea of what this meant. The U.S., because they had an airstrip on Midway and they had carriers, they had 348 planes in the battle. The Imperial Japanese Navy had 272 planes. And throughout the battle, not only did the Japanese lose 4 large aircraft carriers, but they also lost a lot of their pilots and a lot of their planes because their effort to ambush the American fleet got turned around on them. They ended up losing the battle and having an ambush turned on them. The Imperial Japanese Navy never really recovered from this. The Midway Island, which again is only 6 months after Pearl Harbor, is considered probably the turning point in the war. There are various other major battles that say were lesser turning points, but this is the one where the Japanese Navy really got its back broken, and they were never able really to recover from it. At that point, the Allies, primarily at this point, the Americans and the Australians, but with some support from the British, started a program of island hopping from Pearl Harbor, and Midway, they won the victory there. The Japanese were pushed back one island at a time, and it was primarily Admiral Chester Nimitz controlling the Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor that moved up through the center, up to Iwo Jima, and then later Okinawa. And Douglas MacArthur, General MacArthur, had been on Philippines, and when he was ordered to leave the Philippines as it was being taken over by the Japanese, he went down to Australia. From Australia, he was still the senior commander of the Allied forces in this part of the world. He and Chester Nimitz were equal to one another in that regard because he was Army and Nimitz was Navy. But he started up from the south with the forces, and again through New Guinea, the area down here, then up into the Philippine Islands, and then they met in Okinawa. And the Philippines, of course, was a major objective for Douglas MacArthur. Along the way, there's several other battles that are worth mentioning. One of them is the battle, or really campaign, of Guadalcanal. It wasn't just a battle because it lasted for 6 months, from the 7th of August of 1942 to the 9th of February. And Guadalcanal is part of the South Solomon Islands, so it's up here. It's just on the north side of the Coral Sea. This was an important island in terms of, it was large enough, it had the facilities on it to be able to control a larger area of the sea than any other area we had right there. The Japanese had taken Guadalcanal, the main island of Guadalcanal, which is this bigger island, in May of 1942, and they were building an airstrip on it. And from that airstrip, they could have done damage and other, to Australia and New Guinea, other areas here, and really extended their defensive line. But the Allies attacked Guadalcanal. They ended up, there are 3 islands actually. Guadalcanal is the large one. There's a smaller island called Tulagi, and then this island, believe it or not, is called Florida. And so those 3 islands, all 3 were taken by the Allies. And the importance of this battle particularly is it's the very first battle in which the Allies were on the offensive and the Japanese were on the defensive. In every other case, the Japanese were attacking and the Allies were defending. Whether they won or not, the Japanese were still the ones that were on their forward foot. They were attacking. In this case, the Japanese were already there. The Allies attacked them. Now, the Japanese felt that this was important enough that they tried 3 times to retake the island of Guadalcanal. In fact, there were 3 major land battles and 7 large naval battles, along with daily aerial combat over these areas. It was a massive battle scene. That's why we call it the Guadalcanal campaign and not just the Guadalcanal battle. But the Allies succeeded in controlling it. They finished the airfield there, which later was named Henderson Field. And so Guadalcanal became a launching point for other attacks further up particularly into the Philippines as they went along. I talked about this under the Hiroshima, the start of the atomic age, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But bombing by the Allies was not limited to the atomic bombs that fell at the end of the war. In fact, Allied, the closer that they got to mainland China, or mainland, well, it was mainland China, but to the Hawaiian Islands. Hawaiian Islands, what is wrong with me? Japanese islands. There's a difference. The Japanese islands, the closer they got, the more they were able to launch attacks. And again, one of the big deals was that in April of 1942, they introduced the B-29 Superfortress. That's this monster. The B-29 Superfortress had a range of almost 4,000 miles, and it could carry far more armament than any other planes. These were the planes that were also used in dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But because of the island hopping, the B-29s, when they came into battle in April of 42, when they took over Saipan and the islands in that group, they actually had the range with the B-29s to drop bombs in Japan. And so 67 cities in Japan were bombed. There was massive, in fact, the firebombing from the B-29s, they started out trying to drop fragmentation bombs, bombs that explode. Later on, when Curtis LeMay took over the bombing program in January of 44, they began to drop incendiary bombs because most of the cities in Japan were made out of wood. We talked about that. That's homes and everything else were made out of wood. They started out trying to target bombs to industrial areas, and they were successful at that, but unfortunately, a lot of the industry was being carried on in homes or in small factories in neighborhoods and things of that sort. And so the decision was made. To me, this is a bigger ethical question than the dropping of the 2 bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They decided to use firebombing on the major cities in Japan. They never bombed Kyoto because the War Secretary of the United States, Stimson, he and his wife, I think they honeymooned there, but they had visited there, and it's a beautiful city, and they didn't want to destroy it. The history, the religious importance. They also had never bombed Hiroshima, and part of that was because they knew, or at least a few people knew in the back of their minds, that they may be developing a weapon that they needed someplace that had not been bombed previously, that they could use that weapon, and Hiroshima had the misfortune of being that. But in the 67 cities that were firebombed by the Americans, there were estimated, and the estimates vary, estimated 333,000 people killed by the firebombing of Japan, and 473,000 wounded. It was in one bombing alone of Tokyo, in one night, it was called Operation Meeting House. 100,000 people were killed and 16 square miles of the city were destroyed. That's 267,000 buildings in Tokyo. That is more destruction at the point, at the point of the bombing than occurred in either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Now, because of the effects of radiation, there were more fatalities in Hiroshima over a period of time. But that firebombing of Tokyo in March of 1945, the night of the 9th, 10th, killed more people than any other bombing ever. It was the most devastating firebombing ever, worse than Dresden, worse than any of the other, highlights, if you will, or lowlights in terms of bombing throughout history. And so there was a lot of devastation. As I talked about when we talked about the Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the dropping of the atomic bombs, the fact there had been so much destruction, especially in Tokyo, and yet the Japanese were unwilling to surrender at that point. They were militarists who absolutely intended to hold out, and particularly to hold out for a better conditions, rather than an unconditional surrender, which they felt would cause them to get rid of the Allies would get rid of the emperor. They would really destroy the Japanese culture and everything, things that did not happen. But they were afraid of that, and so they were not willing to surrender because they were afraid they could not get good terms. And the more damage they could do in the battles that continued toward the end of the Pacific War, they felt the more likelihood they would have of getting a better deal. But the firebombing was quite extraordinary in its destruction. Most people don't even realize that. The next battle I want to mention, we're back to the Philippines now. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. This was the last battle in which Japan was able to assemble a large fleet of ships to come to battle with the Allied forces. The reason is primarily they were running out of oil. You know, they had been cut off from some of their suppliers. The embargoes they'd sort of defeated, but at this point they are, as more and more of their ships are being destroyed, they don't have ships that can move the oil. Even from places like Indochina that they could get the oil from, they couldn't transport it because their ships were being destroyed. So Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines is the largest battle of World War II in terms of the number of soldiers involved, soldiers and sailors. Some people say that it's probably the largest battle ever in history because there were four actually, major fleets from the Japanese Navy that came in. Oh, I gotta get a smaller thumb. The first attack here, there were four major areas of conflict. The first attack came in here. The second and third fleets met up for the second conflict here. The Japanese had one fleet group that actually was supposed to be a diversion. They were trying to pull off Bull Halsey and the third fleet. They were successful at that at first, and then Halsey turned back around and came down, and then they had a major conflict here. It was a decisive victory for the Allies. Again, the last time the Japanese were ever able to put that many ships, or that many capital ships, in a battle of any kind. So this was a huge turning point. This is also the first time that the Japanese used kamikaze pilots. We talked about the fact that kamikaze means divine wind. It was a name that was given to the two events in the 13th century where the Mongol navies from the Yuan Empire of China were defeated by the weather, typhoons, that drove them off and destroyed many of their ships, and that was called the divine wind, or kamikaze. Later on, the special attack groups, which was their formal name of the kamikaze, not just pilots, they had mini submarines, they had self-guided bombs and divers and various other special attack groups. But Leyte Gulf was the first time that those were used in any significant number, and where they actually took off with that intention. It was not uncommon if their plane was shot up, to try to crash into the enemy, but this was where they had planned for it. And initially when they asked for volunteers for these special attack groups, they got more volunteers than they had planes to put them in. So there was a large return. This slide I only include in order for you to see, we talk about island hopping. This is how many battles were held just in this western part of the Pacific. Every one of these numbers reflects a major battle that was held. Well, major, a battle that was of note. It's in the history books. Some of them were very, very significant. So you get some idea how much was involved in this kind of warfare. We now come to the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, which was the last major battle of the Pacific War, the Battle of Okinawa. This is in April of 1945. It's actually on Easter Sunday, and it lasted until June 21, 82 days. Just like some of the other later battles, the Japanese chose not to defend the beaches. They allowed Allies to land on the beaches, and the Allies had 182,000 Marines and U.S. Army that were landed by the Navy, and the British Navy was providing support with battleships and whatnot. But the 182,000 Allied troops landed. They were not challenged on the beach. They were able to move inland, but the goal here was to take over Okinawa, which is only 340 miles from the main islands of Japan, so that this could be a forward base for the planned invasion of the home islands of Japan. The home islands of Japan, they already had a plan put together, although nobody was thrilled about it, called Operation Downfall, which they were planning to launch in November of 1945, assuming that everything else lined up. But they needed Okinawa as the closest possible base because they could fly not only the B-29 Superfortresses, which have a very long distance, but they could fly B-17s. In fact, they wanted to have a place for 3,000 B-29s and 240 squadrons of B-17s. And Okinawa had that ability. I mean, they had airstrips there, and more could be done with it. The Japanese had 115,000 of their soldiers on the island, plus as many as 100, they think maybe 150,000 of the Okinawans had been recruited, either forcefully or had volunteered because they were told the Allies would do terrible things. I say 150,000 because we have record that 149,000 of them died. And there are only 300,000 native Okinawans to begin with, so half the population of the island was killed. Of the 115,000 Japanese who were there, the 94% of them died. We had 75,000 American casualties, that is deaths and the wounds, people who were wounded. And again, at least they believe half of the 300,000 native Okinawans died. What happened was when they landed in Okinawa, and part of the plan was to move north first, and they had very little opposition here, but then when we turned down and came back south, Shuri Castle, which was the castle, the headquarters for the Ryukyu Island Kings, right below Shuri Castle was where the Japanese had created their headquarters. They were dug in, this is the Allies landing. They were dug in, if you can see this image of a hillside, these are tunnels. And they had tunnels that would lead into the hills, and then from there, they would have various places that it would come out, that they would have artillery, places they could go in and out and protect, and then mines and various things down here. Since they were dug in very well, they ended up having to do a lot of things like, explosives dropped into openings of caverns, the use of flamethrowers from Sherman tanks, very nasty stuff. One of the things that happened on Okinawa as well is 1,780 schoolboys were recruited as frontline soldiers by the Japanese. They were called the Teketsu, I can't even read because this light's out, Teketsu Kinotu, I think it is, which means Iron and Blood Imperial Corps. Half of them were killed in the Battle of Okinawa. Some of them were given explosives and told to run under tanks. It was a very, very sad situation. Also, the highest ranking American that was killed in the Second World War, General Simon B. Buckner, was killed on Okinawa very near the end of the fighting. A bullet struck Coral, and the shrapnel from Coral ended up killing him. Only 7,000 Japanese surrendered. Many of them, including the two primary generals of the Japanese, General Ushijima and General Cho, ended up committing seppuku. So they ended their own lives. But it was a horrendous battle, and as I mentioned before, and it was the last major battle of the Pacific War. In fact, of the Second World War, because the Germans had surrendered in May prior to this, so the European theater war was over. But one of the real concerns that the Allies had was that in the last 3 months of the Pacific War and the battles they had on places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, more than half of all the casualties in the Pacific War happened in the last 3 months. And so this really caused concern, as you can imagine, that the Japanese were willing to do anything rather than allow the Japanese islands to be taken. They were very dedicated soldiers, and one of the things I mentioned at Leyte Gulf was the first place that they had planes that were used as suicide bombers or kamikazes. It was much worse at Okinawa. In fact, there were 3,862 kamikaze pilots that ended up killing 7,000 Allied, so it was almost 2 to 1 in terms of the number killed. I knew that was going to happen. Okay, just a couple more minutes. In Okinawa, there were 241,000 killed, and that's the official record as of fairly recently. It's always difficult to come up with the exact numbers because there was a lot of, bodies destroyed. Some of the Okinawans cast themselves off cliffs. So 241,000 killed. 90%, and you see this here, 90% of all the buildings on the island of Okinawa were destroyed during this battle. And that not only included buildings, but also cultural artifacts, documents. Again, this was an important heritage site because Shuri Castle and the home of the Ryukyun kings prior to this becoming part of Japan. This was the preliminary plan for Operation Downfall, which was the intended plan to assault the main islands, the home islands of Japan. They had planned it to begin in November 1945. There were going to be two phases. The first phase was an attack on Kyushu Island in the south, and then the second, once that was established as a beachhead so that they could use that for planes and whatnot, then there would be an attack further up on Honshu Island, the main island. They were estimating, and estimates vary, but anybody was involved in trying to figure out what's going to be the cost of this. They had estimated as many as 1 million US dead, as many as 4 million wounded, and between 5 and 10 million Japanese killed. So we're looking at estimates that were as high as 11 million deaths and 4 to 10 million wounded. So nobody was real anxious to do this. In fact, the United States government prepared 500,000 Purple Heart medals. The Purple Heart is a medal that is given for someone who is wounded in battle, and they thought they were going to need them because of this plan. As it turns out, they still have a lot of them left over because this plan never happened. They had them available, already made and available to give to Iraqi veterans, for instance, during the Iraq War from this. The decision was made because of those kinds of estimates and because the Japanese had not moved forward despite the Potsdam Declaration that told them what they had to do in terms of surrender, their desire to get a better surrender condition than unconditional surrender because of what they feared might happen. And they kept trying to get Stalin to respond to them because even though Stalin and Russia had not been great friends, they hoped that Stalin, in return for them making concessions for the areas in East Asia that Russia wanted, might negotiate for them a better treatment deal. But as you know, on August 6th, the first nuclear weapon ever employed was dropped on Hiroshima. There were, over the next 4 months, there were between 90,000 and 146,000 deaths. The reason that we're not sure the exact number is because that for the center of the city was completely destroyed. There were no bodies to count. And so it's based upon how many people were thought to have been there. Half of that number, so somewhere between 45,000 and 70,000 died in the first day. So that was less than the one-night bombing of Tokyo by the Allies. 2 days later, on August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, to their surprise, because they'd been trying to negotiate, get the Russians to negotiate for them. They invaded Manchuria and ended up getting all the way down into Korea before the Allies responded. Then the next day, August 9th, because the Japanese had not responded to the insistence for surrender, they dropped the second nuclear weapon ever employed. There have only been two on Nagasaki, and over a 4-month period, they had between 39,000 and 80,000 deaths in Nagasaki. Again, half of those at the point of impact, when the bomb was first dropped. 6 days later, on August 15th, the announcement came that the Emperor was insisting that they do accept the surrender, as difficult as it might be. On September 2nd, on the USS Missouri, the battleship, the Great Mo as they call it, the senior commander of the Allied powers, Douglas MacArthur, received the formal treaty, the signing of the peace treaty and the surrender of the Japanese military forces. Japan ended up being very pleased that they did not set the emperor aside. MacArthur would not allow them to try him for war crimes, and which I think was exactly the right thing, because given the culture at that time, there was very limited amount that the emperor could do. In fact, the fact that he finally stepped up and said, no, we have to accept surrender, even though the terms are not what we want, was quite extraordinary. And there were any number of coups attempted by senior military first, by junior military, by students, in order to try to prevent Japan from surrendering. And as I've said before, there was still a significant Japanese army in China that they felt like, the Navy had been handling most of the Pacific War, but the army, much of the army was still available, the Kwantung Army in China, and so they thought they should fight on. But I think later on they were glad they didn't. Any questions about the Pacific War? Yes, here.
What's the role of the Fighting Tigers?
Yeah, the Fighting Tigers were bringing, I mentioned to you that all of the ports were controlled by the Japanese. And at one point, the Japanese had convinced the British and the French to stop bringing in the materiel. The Fighting Tigers were involved partly in defending efforts to try to bring supplies in from, in many cases, over the Himalayas. I mean, they called it the hump. To bring the material in to try to support China in their battle against the Japanese. I don't know a lot more about it than that, so I can't speak to it really more than that. But that's, you know, that was less directly involved in the Japanese part of the war.